Hey, hello, and welcome to another PPT Mix video. Today we'll be talking about cell structures, or basically the tiny little structural organelles inside of a cell that keep a cell functioning. And then we will finish up by talking about different types of cells and the special features that cells have in order to do very specific jobs.
You get nothing. You lose. Good day, sir.
So before we talk about the cell's internal structures, we need to remember what the cell theory is, or what exactly it means when we're talking about a cell. So cell theory, and this applies to all life on Earth, or at least all life that we know of, that we are aware of in the universe. There are three parts to our cell theory. First off is that everything that is alive has to be made of cells. There's no living form, or there's no form of life anywhere that we know of just yet that is not made up of at least a single cell. Most life is made up of really, really complex groupings of cells, and we say they're multicellular organisms, but we have to have at least a single cell in order to be a living thing. So that means that for our second point, that a cell is going to be the smallest unit of life. And so once you start dividing a cell into its smaller parts, we are no longer looking at a separate living thing anymore. We're looking at the parts that make up that cell, and those parts are no longer considered to be alive by themselves. And then our theory also says that cells can only come from other cells or other pre-existing cells. So later when we talk about cellular division, this has supported the idea that in order for something to grow and for something to develop and repair and replace damaged cells, it has to do cellular division. We cannot have a cell magic itself into the universe or magically appear inside of its body. Typically, it has to be coming from the division of a cell that was already there. Okay, so this is our cell theory. So again, we look at each individual part of our cell theory, and we say all living things are made out of cells, and that really does mean all living things, from a unicellular single-cell organism to a multicellular complex organism, all animals and all plants, all forms of life that have ever been observed on Earth and in other versions like meteors and things that have crashed into Earth, have to have at least some type of cellular structure. Maybe this isn't true for all life in the entire universe, but that is true for what we understand life to be, at least on planet Earth right now. When we think about it being the smallest unit of life, that means that a cell, so the parts that make up the cell, together they create a living thing to do all the different features of a living thing, like movement and respiration, take in nutrition, release excretion, but the individual parts inside of a cell are not necessarily capable of living by themselves. So here we have a paramecium, and on the outside we have little cilia that are here for the movement of the cell, and these little furry, little hands in some ways, like little feet that are kicking and moving, and that helps the paramecium move in different directions. Those cilia are considered to be a structure inside the cell, and they are not individual living things. If we removed a cilia from the cell, the cilia would no longer function as a living thing. Here we can see inside, maybe for certain vacuoles for storing nutrition, and even though they function maybe as a digestive system for this paramecium, or hold on to the nutrition that will slowly be digested over time, if we were to remove those parts from the paramecium, they would no longer function as a living thing anymore. So a cell must have all of its parts in order to be alive, and if we start dividing it, it is no longer considered a living thing. And then our last core concept, so these internal structures, by the way, are called organelles, or you can also call them cellular structures, and they basically function just like tiny organs. That's what organelle means. Organ in terms of organ, and E-L-L-E is something that's very, very tiny, so they're tiny little organs. Okay, and then our last part would be the cellular division, or the idea that cells only come from any other cells. Cells can multiply only by doing division, which means that they grow in size. They will duplicate their genetic information, the DNA that's inside of them, and then they will start to divide in half. And once there was one cell, there will then be two cells. And typically, complex life goes through this process very, very quickly at the very beginning of development. So for a brief period of time, we were all a single cell, And then over the course of our first week of development, we went through hundreds of divisions in order to become a giant ball of cells that could later develop into a fetus and then eventually into a baby human being. So this is also comes from the idea that life has evolved from simpler ancestors. So complex cells came from the evolution or the development of simpler cells, and simpler cells came from even more primitive, earlier versions of cells. So for cells to have developed in complexity, they would also have to do division to keep cellular life alive as evolution continues on Earth. Okay, so that's the cell theory in just a little bit more detail. Now, when we talk about cells being the smallest unit of life, all living things have to carry out very specific processes, and we've kind of managed to organize these processes into 7 specific characteristics, or 7 things that a cell must be able to do. So all cells, or all living things, have to have movement. Now, you're thinking, but not everything moves, and that's not true. Every living thing moves. Some of it might move very slowly, some of it might move only a very specific part of its life, but every single living thing either moves itself or also has internal movement. So even a single-celled organism has to move material around inside of itself in order to, again, example, take in nutrition and then release excretion. So this movement is controlled and organized by the cell, and so it is considered a process. Even though you might not see the movement, even though you don't think it is moving, it is. All living things have the ability to move, either themselves or move things around inside of themselves. All living things have to do respiration. Even plants, even though they do photosynthesis in order to make their own nutrition, they have to do cellular respiration in order to break the stuff that they build, the glucose molecules that they build, down in order to make ATP, which is the energy unit inside of all cells. So there are no forms of life out there that do not do some form of respiration, which is to break molecules down, to break nutrition down in order to create energy. All cells are sensitive or have the ability to detect information about their environment. So larger complex things have sight and sound and taste and smell and all these other senses. But even at the cellular level, even a tiny single-celled paramecium has the ability to detect a little bit of differences in light or can detect differences in temperature. So there's always going to be sensitivity involved in all living things. All living things are able to grow, increase in size, and then also do reproduction as a result of that growth. Some of us have very complex reproductive cycles, and some things, just like bacteria cells, have very simple reproductive cycles where they just increase in size and then divide in half. Then we also have excretion, because everything has to consume nutrition, take in organic material. There is no living thing that can survive completely by itself. Even with plants, plants have to take in things from the environment in order to create nutrition. They have to take in carbon dioxide in order to build sugar molecules. They have to take in nutrition from the roots in order to build amino acids that build proteins. So everything is dependent on gaining organic material, fats, sugars, proteins from the world around them so that they can use them. And there's no such thing as a form of life that is 100% efficient. So there's always going to be waste material. Typically this material is toxic to the living thing, so the living thing will excrete it or get rid of that waste material that's been created by being alive. And so we have excretion and nutrition as our last point. So again, as we probably talked about before, Ms. Gren, as you can see here, we can kind of form a name there. Ms. Gren is a really good way to try to remember at least the beginning letters for all of these characteristics. And it's important that you do memorize these 7 characteristics. They come up this year, they'll come up next year, they'll come up as you continue to study biology in the future. Okay, so let's start to talk about the cell structures. So cells will go through compartmentalization, or the idea that they will break down their body into specific regions, or their structure, specific structures, or organelles is another way you can think of it, that do very specific jobs. And this is actually very common in life. We see that our large complex systems, our large complex body is broken down into systems. You have a digestive system, a circulatory system, a nervous system. for keeping you alive? Well, a cell has very specific parts that help keep the cell alive and do a very specific job. So compartmentalization, we see, comes from these tiny organs, or these organelles, that are designed to do really specific jobs. Now, there are lots of different organelles inside of cells. Some of them are in animal cells only, some of them are in plant cells only, a lot of them are in both animals and plant cells. However, we're not going to learn all of them. We're going to learn the few important ones, and as you go through biology in earlier or higher level grades, you'll learn the rest of them. But again, these organelles do a very, very specific job that maintains the health of the cell, or what we call homeostasis. Living things always have to maintain homeostasis. It means basically to be stable and to alive. Again, some organelles are in all cells, for example, the plasma membrane, the cytoplasm. Those are all in all cells. Some of them will only be found in either an animal cell or a plant cell. All right, so we're going to just go through each one of the organelles that we want to learn this year and kind of talk about what its structure is and what it does. Okay, so we're going to start off with organelles that are in our animal cell. And the very first one, the most maybe important one you could think of, is our cell membrane or plasma membrane. There's different vocabulary you can use. The cell membrane is basically the barrier that determines what is the inside and what is the outside of the cell. And so that's actually really, really important role, a really important task for our cell membrane, is to decide what is going to come into the cell and what is going to leave the cell. So it's kind of like our wall that's separating the cell from the rest of the world, and it has a gate or has proteins inside of it that help move things in and out of the cell depending on concentration gradients and if the cell needs them or not. Now, this is a very, very, very thin barrier, but is very effective because of its design. It's actually only about 7 nanometers wide, but it does a really good job of keeping out any material that the cell doesn't need, and it's pretty effective at maintaining the stability of the cell. Now, we say a cell membrane is selectively permeable. That means that it has the ability to let in some molecules, and when other molecules will not be able to pass through it. So again, transport proteins, or proteins that are inside the membrane, they can act like doors and tunnels that will allow some things to pass through the membrane, depending on if they're the ones that the cell is selecting for. So it allows the cell to have a little bit of regulation or control of what's happening. And again, so the selective permeability, it comes from these transport proteins, or these special tunnels and doors made of protein that are designed for very specific molecules, and so they will allow some things to come into the cell where other things are not allowed to go through into the cell. Okay, next up we have the nucleus, which is kind of like the brain of the cell, the control center of the cell. And really the reason we say that is because inside of the nucleus is going to be chromatin, or basically DNA, that is loosely coiled, loosely packed. And so the chromatin is the active form of the DNA. So here is we also see the nucleolus, which is a large collection of DNA kind of all actively being used inside of the nucleus. And so this chromatin that's here floating around in this like loosely packed section, okay, that is DNA that's being actively used, and it's being used basically to create proteins, to create enzymes, those tunnels I was just talking about inside the cellular membrane, and it's kind of sending out very specific instructions that are set inside of the DNA. Now, not all of the DNA inside of a cell is being used at all the time, so typically it's only the chromatin, or the loosely packed DNA. That's the stuff that's actually being used, where the more densely packed DNA that we see here in the middle that makes up the nucleolus, that's not really active DNA. That's why it's kind of all packed together and just kind of put out of the way, because it's not really needed anymore. So again, that's the nucleus, and it's kind of like our control center that holds the DNA and sends out instructions for the rest of the cell to follow. Now, in order for the cell to be doing all of this activity, in order to power the enzymes, in order for some of the transport proteins to use active transport, a cell is going to have a mitochondria. And a mitochondria is basically a really, really tiny, kind of bean-shaped organelle. And inside is a bunch of inner membranes. So we've got an outer membrane on the outside here, and then on the inside there's folded membrane that goes back and forth which creates a lot of surface area. And because that's important, because here on this inner membrane is where all the ATP is going to be created. So by having a really, really large surface area inside the mitochondria, it can actually make a lot of ATP all at once. So we say the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, or the idea that it produces energy for the cell. So it will take glucose, it will take fats, it will take proteins that aren't being used, and it will break them down. And by breaking them down, it will release energy that can be captured in very specific units called ATP. Sorry. So one of the things it will do, for example, will be cellular respiration. It could take glucose, we see here as C6H12O6, and it will combine with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide, which we breathe out every time we exhale, some water, which will just remain in our body and move around and eventually leave through our kidneys and our urinary system. But then, very important, it makes ATP in the form of energy in the form of ATP that keeps the cell functioning. So again, it has this two membranes, and the inner membrane is folded many, many times because the membrane is where ATP is going to be produced. And so by having a lot of membrane in a very, very small space means that we can make lots of energy in a very, very short amount of time. Okay, so two relatively unimportant, they're very important. Some people maybe don't think about them very much. Organelles would be our cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is basically all of the empty space inside of the cell. And the animal cells and plant cells, where there's empty space, it's not actually empty space. It is cytoplasm. And cytoplasm is a kind of gel-like or jelly-like fluid that's really, really thick and fairly sticky. It's inside of the cell, and it fills up all of the free space inside of the cell. And it kind of allows all of these organelles to kind of be floating around inside of the cell as the cell is moving and the world around it is changing. So it kind of helps keep everything in the right place inside of the cell. And it's also going to have a lot of water inside, and that water is going to be important for all of the different chemical reactions that the enzymes are going to be doing inside the cytoplasm as well. So it's just a fluid, jelly thick fluid that's going to be really important for holding organelles and then for allowing a lot of chemical reactions. Also inside the inside the cytoplasm, will be vesicles. Now here we're kind of seeing vesicles in these tiny little dots in our image, but actually vesicles are really, really, really tiny. You're not going to see them unless you're using a very powerful electron microscope. And vesicles are basically just small spheres of membrane, and they're normally there just to store things for the cell and help move things around inside of the cell. So there could be nutrients inside, or enzymes that are there to help do reactions, or maybe there's waste material from a bunch of chemical reactions that happened inside the cytoplasm. Whatever the content is, it's basically there, to store or to move it around the cell, and eventually either get that material released or maybe move that material to another organelle so that another organelle can use it. Typically, vesicles do not last very long. They're mostly going to be used for endocytosis, which is to pull material into the cell in a very large bulk fashion, or exocytosis, which is to push material out of the cell, typically waste material, in a large bulk fashion. But yeah, that's it, just little membrane sacs that are basically used for storage and for movement. So that covers all of the organelles for our animal cell. That's not all the organelles inside of an animal cell, but that's the ones we're going to learn for this grade level. And you'll learn more organelles when you get to grade 11. And so all the organelles we covered will also be found inside a plant cell. So I'm not going to repeat all the ones I just said, just know that they will also be inside of a plant cell as well. But there are a few extra organelles that are special or only found inside of a plant cell, and we're going to talk about some of them. So the very first one, and probably the easiest one to see under a microscope, would be the cell wall. Now the cell wall, here you can see it in this green line that's kind of separating the inside and outside of all of these cells that make up this plant tissue. The cell wall is very, very thick, rigid wall made of cellulose, and it kind of gives the shape of the cell and supports its structure. And if we were building a large, complex plant material, it's kind of what builds the plant up against the force of gravity. If we didn't have the cell wall, it would be very difficult for plant cells to grow up against the force of gravity because they need something strong to grow on. Animals and animal cells, we have bone structure and muscles, and that kind of supports all of our organs, where plants don't have that. So in order to grow into these really large, complex organisms, each one of their cells is supported by its own little kind of cage structure, which would be called the cell wall. Now, eventually, when the cell dies, all of the material that is inside of the cell is going to leave. However, the cell wall will stay behind because cell walls are very, very difficult to digest. There's actually only a few species of bacteria, really, that can digest cell walls easily. And so this material, as the plant dies and dries out, eventually becomes wood. So the wood in the desk that you might be learning on right now, or the pencil that you're using right now as you're writing, is just basically made out of all of these leftover cell walls after the plant cells have died. So it is very strong material. Now, also inside of our plant cells, we're going to have our vacuole, specifically what we call a large central vacuole or a permanent vacuole. And so the vacuole is kind of like a vesicle because it is going to be used for storage and it can help move things around inside the cell. But a vacuole is really, really huge. In fact, it can take up about 90% of the volume of a plant cell. It's massive compared to a vesicle. So it's not a vesicle. It's better than a vesicle. It's much bigger than a vesicle. And it does a couple of things. First off, it's there to help store things for the cell. It can store enzymes and food. It also stores water that the plant is going to need if it's going to be doing photosynthesis. And it's very, very large, so it can hold lots of water. And because of that, where is it? Here you go. The water ends up creating a pressure that kind of pushes against the weight of the cell wall. And so that means, for example, if we had a plant cell here, and we had this thick cell wall, as we're growing upwards, gravity is still pushing down on this plant cell. And so this part is being pushed inwards, this part's being pushed inwards, this part's being pushed inwards. And if there's not enough water inside of our plant cell, these cell wall sections can start to bend inwards a little bit, like that. And that actually makes the plant bend as well. And so you would expect a plant to look like this if there wasn't enough water inside of our plant cell. So in order to make the plants stand upright against the force of gravity, you need to have a large vesicle on the inside, sorry, not vesicle, a large vacuole on the inside, and it needs to be full of lots and lots of water. And so that water can create pressure that goes against the cell wall, and it pushes the cell walls in all directions evenly and supports the cell walls and keeps them in the proper shape. So that means that if we add enough water and the water goes into the vesicles, eventually these plants will start to stand upright against the force of gravity because of the vacuole. So the vacuole and the cell wall are kind of working together to help keep the plant growing up nice and straight. And that's another reason why the large central vacuole is so important. And it's also kind of why it is so big, because it's creating this water pressure that helps keep the plant cells, cell walls in the right position. And next, inside of a plant cell, we would expect to find, of course, our chloroplasts. Now, not all plant cells will have a chloroplast. The plant cells that you make up the roots of the plants, the part that's underground the entire time that the plant is alive, the root cells would not have any chloroplasts because the root cells are not going to be exposed to light. So there's no reason to have them have chloroplasts because they're not going to do photosynthesis. The root cells will supply water to the leaves, and the leaves will then supply energy to the root cells. So it's a nice community exchange. They're all working together to keep this plant alive. Now, chloroplast, of course, is where photosynthesis is going to occur. And that means that sunlight, or radiant energy, is going to pass through the chloroplast, and the plant is going to be able to use that energy and water and carbon dioxide, and it's going to use a bunch of complex chemical reactions that result in the production of fats and sugars like glucose. So we can see that photosynthesis is very much the opposite reaction of cellular respiration. Cellular respiration, we took sugar and we took oxygen, and it created energy and water and CO2. Now we're going in the opposite direction. We're using CO2, we're using water, and we're taking energy from sunlight, and that is going to create oxygen and carbon dioxide, or sorry, glucose, for example. Now, the cell can use glucose, and it can use oxygen as well in order to break it back down to do cellular respiration and make more energy. However, it doesn't use sugar as much as an animal does, or active animal cells. So a lot of the CO2 is going to be released into the atmosphere and leave the plant, and that's good for us because we use that oxygen in our cellular respiration, and that causes us to release CO2, and so our CO2 can go to the plants and help the plants do photosynthesis. So we have a nice balance between plants and animal cells in the world around them. And so the thing inside the chloroplast that's capable of doing all this complex chemistry really starts with chlorophyll. Now, chlorophyll is a special pigment or special chemical, and it's able to absorb energy and the light energy and capture it, and then use that energy in order to do photosynthesis. It's really good at absorbing all forms of light except for green. Green wavelengths, green colored light, does not go into chlorophyll very easily. So if you're not absorbing the energy, you must be reflecting it. There's only two things that can happen with energy. It either gets absorbed or it gets reflected. So since the green light, the green energy, the energy in the green light is being reflected away, that is why we see plants as being green, because that's the only wavelength of light that is bouncing off of the plant and just going in another direction. And so eventually that light hits our eyes, and so we perceive it as being green. So chlorophyll is the reason for plants being so green in color. All right, so let's do a little bit of a review. Let's do some animal cells versus plant cells. So you can pause the video real quick if you want to like check off and see where these things would belong, if it's plants only, animals only, or both. All right, so you paused it. Okay, so our plasma membrane or cell membrane, you can really use either word. Of course, that would be inside both animal cells and plant cells. All cells are going to have a plasma membrane because all cells need to have a clear line between what is inside the cell and what is outside the cell. Our cell wall would be plants only. Animal cells do not have cell walls. If they did, we would not be able to move around as much. We would be very stiff and difficult to move, just like a plant is. Nucleus, obviously, is going to be both plant and animal cells. Bacteria cells, or very simple cells, do not have a nucleus. Right? They're called prokaryotic cells, so they're lacking a nucleus. However, eukaryotic cells are large complex cells like plants, animals, fungi, protists. They all have a nucleus. In terms of cytoplasm, we would expect both animals and plant cells to have cytoplasm. It's that sticky fluid that fills up all the empty space inside of the cell. In fact, again, every cell or every type of cell that exists is going to have cytoplasm. It's going to be full of the sticky liquid. In terms of a vacuole slash vesicle, and plants, we would expect the vacuole to be very, very, very large. They could still have small vesicles, but it's mostly going to be a very large vacuole. In animal cells, the vacuole slash vesicle idea, they're all going to be very, very small because it's not necessary to have a large vacuole that's pushing against the weight of the cell wall. And then mitochondria, for animal cells and plant cells, they are both going to have mitochondria because they're both going to rely on doing cellular respiration through the mitochondria. And for our chloroplasts, of course, they're going to be plants only because only plants are going to be doing photosynthesis. Okay, so I hope you got all these correct and you're sure and aware of the different types of organelles that we find in our animal cells, which ones we find in our plant cells, and their structure and function of all of these different parts of the cell. Okay, so with the slides that are remaining, we just want to go through some very specific types of cells and kind of talk about why they're a little bit different or a little bit special compared to just your average animal cell or your average plant cell. First off, we're going to talk about our red blood cells. Red blood cells, they have a very particular shape that helps increase, have a lot of surface area. And inside the cytoplasm, they are going to be full of hemoglobin. In fact, most of the mass of the red blood cell is going to have this protein called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is important because that's the protein that allows the red blood cell to hold onto oxygen and move oxygen through the body. So oxygen, or hemoglobin, is very important for the transporting of oxygen. Now again, it has a very particular shape It looks kind of like a donut that hasn't completely been punctured through, and has this biconcave shape. And this disc biconcave shape actually is what helps increase the surface area. So there's a really, really large surface area versus the volume of the cell, which makes it nice and stable. And by having a greater amount of surface area, it can absorb oxygen faster and release oxygen faster as well whenever it's needed. And again, something that's interesting or different from makes red blood cells different from other animal cells is that red blood cells do not have a nucleus. So the nucleus actually isn't needed inside of a red blood cell because the red blood cell doesn't really have to do any complicated chemical reactions. It doesn't have to regulate anything or change anything about itself. All it needs to do is float around inside of our blood and move oxygen from one place, our lungs, to another place, which is anywhere else in the body oxygen is needed. So by removing the nucleus, or not having a nucleus in a developed, mature red blood cell, there's more space inside of the red blood cell for hemoglobin. And so by having lots of space for hemoglobin, we can carry more oxygen, which allows the red blood cells to be more efficient for their job. So that's how a red blood cell is a little bit different from an animal cell and better designed for its function. Next up, we're going to talk about our ciliated cells. Ciliated cells look like regular animal cells, except they have these cilia on them, which are these little hairs that are sticking out either one side or multiple sides of the cell. And cilia are really important because they can help move material away, particular dust and bacteria, from your lungs. So you would expect to find a bunch of ciliated cell inside your lungs and your throat. And so basically what happens is that there is a very, very thick mucus that will develop on top of the cilia. So here's our thick mucus. And so when you breathe in, sometimes you breathe in certain bacteria, sometimes you breathe in dust particles and dirt, right? And so you don't want that material to stay inside of your body. It's not good for you. The bacteria can cause infection. The dirt it's dirty. It's just taking up space, and it's not good for your cells. So what happens is the cilia will all move in unison in a single direction, and so they will push the mucus with all the bacteria and dust that is collected, and it will move it out of your lungs and up towards your esophagus. And then when you swallow something, you could spit it out if you spit it out, or every time that you swallow, you actually swallow a little bit of this mucus, and there the mucus will then move into your stomach, and the bacteria and the dust is destroyed by the acid of your stomach. So basically it's a whole bunch of these little cilia hairs here, and they're all going to be responsible for moving this mucus out of your lungs and helping to keep your lungs nice and clean. So next up we have our root hair cells, which are designed to help absorb minerals and water from the soil. So we would expect these in our plant cells. You can see that we have a thick cell wall around our plant cell. And again, this being a plant cell, it's not the same thing as a ciliated cell. This is not a cilia here. That's not cilia that we're looking at. We're actually looking at an extension of the entire cell itself. And even the cell wall has grown all the way around this extension. Okay? And so we've got different features that allow for this root hair cell to help absorb as much water as possible. So for example, this is again going to be in the root. So we're not going to see any chloroplasts floating around inside the cytoplasm, because there's no need to have chloroplasts, because there's no light under the ground, so there's no photosynthesis. Then we have this semi-permeable extension, which is going to allow lots of water and ions to flow into the cell, right? And so we have our cell membrane, which is going to be really, really good at absorbing minerals and water from the soil. And then these extensions cause there to be an increased surface area for the cell, and so that means that the cell can absorb the water and minerals from the soil a lot faster. So we've got this root hair, we've got semi-permeable membrane, we've got our lack of chloroplasts, and these are again all special features that allow a root hair cell to basically do its job. And here you can see here's many, many, many root hair cells. All that fuzziness is represented. Each one of those little fuzzy ends is an individual root hair cell, and that's where we would expect to see it. And the roots as a plant is developing early on in life. Next up, we have a nerve cell. Nerve cells are designed to carry messages very quickly over really long distances. You need to send information that you see and that you hear and that you feel, and need to go all the way from your sensors to your nerve cells, to the nerve cell, to the spinal cord, up to your brain, and your brain has to make a decision on something, and so you might move out of the way of something, or you might drop something because it's burning your hand, and then you need to like send information to your muscles to make your muscles move, to make your body jump out of the way, or make your hand let go of something that maybe is burning you, and so it has to be a very, very great distance. You might think that that's not that far to go from your hand up to your brain, then to your hand muscles, but actually in terms of a cell, remember the cells are very, very tiny, that's a very huge distance. And so we need to send information very quickly through this long distance, and so these nerve cells are designed to do that. So they have very, very long bodies, and so they can travel, the information traveling through the cell can go over a very long distance. They have the ability to basically carry electrical signals, and so an impulse, or this information, can travel very quickly through the membranes of the nerve cells, because of the way the membrane of the nerve cell is designed. And at the end, the connections allow for the information to spread to lots of other nerves very, very quickly. And that's important for you because the more connections that your nerve cells are able to make, the faster your reactions will be, the more complicated thought process you can do, the more things you can remember. So basically what you're doing when you're studying is you're helping your nerve cells to practice moving information around your brain so that you learn and keep that information somewhere inside those connections between all of the different nerves, and help establish a memory and information that you can recall if you need to. Okay, so we're almost done, just 3 more cells left. We have our mesophyll cell, and the mesophyll cell basically just contains lots and lots and lots of chloroplasts because it is there as the main cell for doing photosynthesis. So there are different types of mesophyll cells. We can find them in the top layer. So this is a section of a leaf. So here's our top section of the leaf, and then there's our bottom section of the leaf, so depending if you're looking at the top or the bottom. But basically they're going to have as much chloroplast as possible. And again, if we were to look at them under a microscope, it would be actually fairly easy to see the chloroplasts because there's just so many of them. They're just packed full of chloroplasts so that they can basically do photosynthesis as quick as possible for the plant. We also have sperm cells, which are animal cells that have been designed to travel really long distances. And so they will have a lot of mitochondria, and they will have a really, really long extension of a tail that we call a flagella. And a flagella is not the same thing as a cilia. Cilia are very short and very, very narrow and very small, where a flagella normally is fairly long and actually fairly easy to see. So the flagella acts like a tail to help the sperm swim as it's going the distance to find the egg that it's going to fertilize. And then it requires a lot of energy to be able to do that. And so inside of the sperm cell, we see lots and lots of mitochondria. And so the mitochondria can produce energy to keep the flagella moving so that the sperm can travel a really long distance. And our last cell is our stem cell. And stem cells are really important because really the stem cells are where all of these different types of cells I've talked about came from. So there are plant stem cells and there are animal stem cells. And a stem cell is an undifferentiated cell, or a cell that has not committed to being a very specific type of cell. It has not decided if it's going to be a muscle cell or a nerve cell or a blood cell yet. And so stem cells are a really important part of medical research right now, because if we can give someone stem cells when they are damaged or certain cells in their body have been damaged, the stem cells might be able to develop into new versions of those types of cells. So if somebody has a damaged spinal cord, their nerve cells are not going to be able to repair themselves. However, if we can give them stem cells under the right conditions, maybe the stem cells are able to develop into new nerve cells, and they can fix the problem inside of someone's spinal cord, and they might be able to feel again or be able to walk again. And so just stem cells, typically, they look like perfectly normal animal cells, but they'll have a fairly large nucleus, and the reason why it's so large is because all of the DNA is chromatin. All of it is active DNA, because certain parts of the DNA haven't started to been condensed and turned off yet, because essentially the cell can become any type of cell. So stem cells are just super important because they can just become any of the 200 different types of cells that make up your body. Okay, so that is it for the PPT notes, and I hope you enjoyed this video and it's helping you with your revision through this unit.